I would like to introduce Rory O'Connor, who is an expert in standardization of different things, not only in ICT. Hello.
Hello, thank you very much for the opportunity. Nice to speak to you.
Well, the first question would be about standards as they are the fundamentals, because they are supposed to let all those things in ICT work simply, so that different things understand themselves in exactly the same way without any differences. But at the same time, there are so many standards, so many different standards, that we are a little bit getting lost on the whole list of them. So do we have any kind of dictionary of available standards?
Well, unfortunately, the answer is no. There isn't one standard dictionary of standards. What you have is various international standards groups and also industry standards groups that are producing different standards, and in some cases, they're actually in direct competition with each other. So certain industry standards groups would be replicating what may be done by governments and by international standards organizations from a point of view of being in direct competition. So unfortunately, there's a menu of standards there to choose from, and indeed choosing the right one can be quite a challenge for many companies.
Right, so I would add, it looks like quite an interesting option for scientific research to create kind of dictionary of available standards, as you said, a menu.
Indeed, there has been some work done in just the International Standards Organization alone, which is one, albeit the largest standards body, in there trying to map the relationship between the various standards they have. And this has become known as the standards quagmire, because the diagram is so complex and there are so many relationships that actually it's a very difficult task, unfortunately. But what we're finding is that more often than not, certain industries or in certain sectors or certain domains, a small group of standards is coming to the fore. So, for example, in the areas like medical devices, medical device software, a small set of standards have come to the front as being the most common. And also in, for example, the automotive industry, you'll find that functional safety software standards have come to the fore as the most important. So there are certain sets of standards which are evolving to become accepted by industry and therefore the more important ones.
So as you said, we have a number of the most important, most significant standards, and probably hundreds of standards that are in second or third line. But when we are, let's say, a given or some company, maybe not that big, so that we do not have a dedicated person who would just analyze everything, how to find the right standard that might be useful in our specific company?
Well, I suppose that very much depends on what you're looking for. If you're developing a particular software or hardware product, for example, then the standards quite often are easier to find. If you're developing a piece of hardware, for example, there will be certain standards. They might be compliance with electrical emissions, things like that, that are much easier to discover. Management standards, on the other hand, are quite a variety of them, and many competing standards. And often some of the best places to look is going to be online, going to the national standards representative in your own country. So in Ireland, for example, it's the National Standards Authority of Ireland, where I am, but each country has its own national standards body, and they're the ones that guide and advise industry and give you the various options available and try to assist in navigating the complex world of standards.
Right. Let's say when we are, well, you said during your speech that there are dozens of standards, let's say on the technical level, that apply to technology in general. But we have also standards, of course, that apply to that management, organizational level. While for the IT industry, I would say, the technical level is obvious, I would say that the soft level is not that obvious, and usually, or maybe very often, it's quite ignored. Do you agree?
Unfortunately, yes, I have to agree. A lot of the management standards and so on do have a bad reputation. People see them as being very bureaucratic, as having a lot of red tape, as maybe stifling innovation and also being expensive and taking away from the real work. And this is definitely not the case. There is a lot of research to show the benefits of standards and standardization, even to very small companies. And part of the work that I do in publishing in popular industry magazines as well as academic outlets is trying to socialize the concept of standards and the benefits amongst industry people, and trying to really show that there are key benefits, not necessarily following a particular standard slavishly. In other words, you might not have to do every single thing. It may be a question of tailoring the usage of a standard to your particular situational context, and therefore getting the very best out of a standard to assist the business. And it's not about doing anything that is unnatural or difficult for the business, but actually trying to do something that's helpful and complementary.
Well, right. And you just said that standards can be applied to even very small companies. But in the case of IT, those very small companies are usually startups who are very, very energetic, very, very keen on the idea that they've just created. And so because of that idea, the whole company appeared. But those startups, in my opinion, are in contrary to standardization. So how would you apply any standard to something that was just born and is in the baby on the baby level of its life cycle?
Yeah, and so you've identified one of the key challenges in the software business is that there's a huge amount of very small and very young companies, and as you say, they are concentrating very much on just trying to get the product created. I view them as like a mouse on a treadmill. They're so busy spinning the treadmill that they're not thinking, is there a better way to run? And the objective of people like me is going in to say, hang on, there's a better way of doing this, a faster, more efficient way, but you have to show tangible and immediate benefits. So I've been involved in a number of standards which have been specifically designed for small companies, and we've tested them with startups, and you have to show immediate business value or they will simply not use them. So quite often it's not about using the whole standard, but it's about applying for the elements or the parts of it that will work for their particular context at their particular time. So it's not about getting a certificate of compliance for a standard, but seeing, there's an advantage in following certain best practices. But also, it's about showing the market requirement and market need. So very often these small startup companies are competing in fiercely competitive landscape against existing and sometimes much older and more mature competitors in the industry. And how do those young startups show that they're credible in the marketplace? And that's often where elements of certification against standards come into place. They may be able to say, we're very small, we're very young, but we're still certified against a standard, therefore you can trust and believe in us as a company. So typically it's a combination of those sorts of things that help to promote standards in small companies.
Right, and can you give us some examples of standards that can be easily applied in those extremely small companies, startups?
Yeah. So one of the most common known quality management standards would be ISO 9000, and that is something which is essentially about having a quality manual for a company. And the smallest company I've personally seen using that standard is a company of one person. And they were able to write the quality standard documentation. It was a document of less than 40 pages. So the amount of effort involved was actually quite modest, but yet this company got certified, so we're able to produce this certificate to clients to show an element of stability and maturity of this very small company, and ultimately that was helped in the competitive landscape. And another example may be the relatively new standard ISO 29110, which is a specific software process lifecycle standard designed for very small companies. So it has a range of technical reports within the standard which aim for companies anything up to the size of 25 people. But the first group for first profile within that group is for staff of 1 to 5. So that's specifically designed for very small companies where they don't have full-time people involved in standardization, and you have to have very small, very quick, and very simple to use elements of the standard. And we've conducted some academic case studies, particularly in Canada, with companies like this, and it's been proved to be quite successful.
Okay, and something that will be dedicated to the process of software development?
Yeah, so those, like 29110 is an example that purely for software development, it basically has a process of 2 tasks of software project management and software process implementation, and it's a very simple, straightforward process. It has approximately 10 tasks in it, about 20 in total deliverables, and a company developing a process guide for this may write their process guide in something very small, maybe 8 or 10 pages for a company. So it has direct benefits with the low overheads, and that's what you're looking for, in particularly in young and startup companies, is a low overhead to entry into the usage of standards.
So how long would it take to implement such standard in a startup company?
So this varies dramatically depending on the nature of the standard and also how much of it you're going to do. A lot of the time when I work with very small companies, I will explain to them the overall architecture of a standard and say, now let's pick the bits of this that are most suitable to you, the elements of it that will get you the most benefit. So we may just take 1 or 2 aspects, such as the requirements engineering aspect of a software project, and say, let's just implement this to make sure you get better requirements management. And we might do that in a period of 1 month. And then once they see some benefits to that, then you say, okay, now let's go for the second part of that. Let's look at the architectural and design elements. So in fact, it's actually incremental over time. For very small companies, that's often the way you essentially take it small steps at a time, and you might build up over a period of a year before they actually use the entire thing. So sometimes just delivering everything in one big bang would be overwhelming for a company. And would maybe cost too much in time or effort, whereas small bite-sized pieces where you're seeing a direct advantage to the business can be quite successful.
Okay, and the cost side, isn't it too overwhelming?
It once again depends on the standards. Certain standards can be very expensive. There are software process standards out there like CMMI, for example, and you hear figures quoted of anything from $10,000 to $100,000 for companies to do full assessments. So it very much depends on the nature of what you're getting into, and also how much you want to tailor the process. I will say to companies, start using the practices, start seeing the benefits, and worry about things like formal certification and conformity assessment at a later date. Firstly, just try to see the advantage. And maybe for some companies, small, clean advantages that they see over their existing processes is all they need, and they will never actually go to use a full 100% of a standard, but they are getting benefits, and that in itself can be an end rather than a full-blown standardization.
Well, I asked about the cost side, specifically from the perspective of those very small companies or those startups. And thinking about especially the 29001 standard, which you mentioned that is tailored or specific for those for that group of companies. So can you tell me if for those companies that specific standard should be perceived as expensive or not expensive, maybe not to certify, but to implement in the way you said?
So this standard is a nice example of one that's very inexpensive to be able to use. So most importantly, because of the nature of the marketplace that's after, the ISO agreed to make the standard available for free, so the companies don't have to pay for the standard, and sometimes the actual document can be expensive. And then what we have made available as the writers of that standard is a series of implementation guides which are freely available. These are the how-to. Not just what we have to do, but exactly how to do it. And a lot of companies can simply take this material and do it themselves. They don't need to have independent consultants or specialists coming in. In certain cases, they'll get involved in academic research projects with people like me going into a company and giving freely of my time in order to do case studies in a company for academic research. In other times, there are consultants out there who are getting involved in providing consultancy to companies, but they have to be realistic about what they're charging. They're going into very small 2, 3, 4-person companies, and therefore they're not going into large corporations with big budgets. So there's a certain element of realism there on both sides of the market.
Right, so we have a standard that can be easily applied, is cheap. So I would say, why all those companies do not choose it, do not go for it?
That's still a very difficult question for us to grapple with, because a lot of the time it's a question of, as I said earlier on, with like the mouse on the treadmill. They're so busy running, they don't stop and really think, can I do this better? Can I run more efficiently my company? And a lot of the time we're finding that we need to go to the companies and show them the real benefits from this. And what they want to see is almost like war stories from other businesses that have been through this and seen the advantage, and they'll believe in it. Also, I believe that governments and industry agencies have quite a lot of influence and responsibility in a sphere like this. So in certain countries, we're able to see that the governments push particular standards. So in the case of 29110, for example, both the Mexican government and the Thailand government are very strong backers of this, and therefore that standard has become quite popular in those countries because they're pushing this for competitive advantage on an international landscape. And so quite often it's both a carrot and a stick. You need to be able to show them there is motivations to do it, and also maybe some coercion to try to improve as well.
What I think, another point to this may be the education, because those very small companies are very often created by very young people who just finished their education. So maybe there is something missing in the whole process.
Certainly, I think standards education at university in particular is in general, I think, less than it should be. I can speak for my own university that we teach a lot of standards, but that's my own personal influence possibly. But standardization is generally not taught enough, in my opinion. In certain disciplines, you can see, for example, civil engineering and electronic engineering, where standards are absolutely necessary and therefore are commonly taught. But, for example, in the more general business and management world, things like business management standards, IT governance standards, service management standards are quite often neglected in terms of formal education. And I think we in universities have a role to play there.
Okay, so as a conclusion, I would say that we do not have to be afraid of the standards. They're not that expensive, at least not all of them. And they can be, not all of them are so hard to apply. Some of them are quite easy to apply. So we should not avoid them as we do right now. We should implement them wherever it is possible and benefitable for us, right?
Absolutely, I agree. What it is about is finding the quick and easy wins in adopting a standard where it produces some direct benefit to the business and can be done with a reasonably low entry, and not to be doing maybe things that are unnatural for the business just to say they're complying with the standard. And it is through the adoption of this best practices, the tailoring of those practices, that companies will get to see an advantage for them, and that ultimately affects the bottom line and should help propagate standards in the business.
Okay, thank you for the conversation.
Thank you very much.